announcements. We're talking walking in the dark. And, I hope you've been encouraged in this series. I hope this has been something that you've been going, this is for me in my season of life. I'll tell you, last week's is going to go online tomorrow. I got it onto my computer, but for some reason the internet kept having issues when I was trying to upload it. So last week and this week all will go up tomorrow. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to recap real quick where we've been so we can talk about where we are today. So the first thing is our theme verses are found in Psalm 23, which in Psalm 23, beginning in verse, I believe, 4 or 5. 4. Valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then jumping into verse 6, it says, surely your goodness and love follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And all of us are going to walk through dark tunnels, dark valleys in our lives. If you can raise your hand and say, I've never walked through one, I'm sorry, but you're lying. Or you have some kind of knowledge that I just don't understand, because the reality is, though you may be okay in your dark valley, you're walking through a valley. You walk through, because the circumstances of this life are terrible, because we live in a fallen world. So why are we talking about tunnels? Why do we walk through tunnels? Why do we go through tunnels? Well, we need to get to the other side of an obstacle, and God is bringing us through the tunnel for a purpose. He's trying to teach us things. He's trying to get us to a greater relationship with Him. Because let's just all be real. When you walk through hard times, you're not crying out to somebody who can't help you. You're crying out to God. Yes. You're saying, God, I need you. I need you to show up. I need you to come through. And so why does God bring us into a tunnel? Sometimes He brings us into a tunnel just because we've relied too much on our own strength, right? Yep. And in the moment you go, man, this is annoying. I wish I hadn't fallen back in this. Well, guess what? Just don't do it again. Don't rely on yourself. How do we do that? We remember what brought us into that tunnel in the first place. Tunnels have purposes. What do we do in the tunnel? We maintain our speed. We don't slow down. We don't stop when we're afraid or we're frustrated. We keep moving forward. We turn our lights on. We spend time in prayer. We open God's Word. We listen to godly counsel. We keep lights shining on our path ahead. What else do? We stay in our lane. We don't compare to the person to our right or to our left, because they are on their own path, and God has us on our path for a reason. Last week we talked about ways to advance quicker through the tunnel, or at least turn the brights on in your car so you can see easier, and that was fasting. And so, like I said, tomorrow the sermon on fasting goes online if you weren't able to catch it. It was a great one. I had a lot of people tell me that they appreciated how practical it was, but also there were some tidbits that they had never heard about fasting or didn't understand before. And so we as a church are going to go through a fast beginning in mid-February and entering into early March. And so I'm going to give you a few things on that at the end of our service today, but that's where we are. So today, we're talking about our demeanor in the tunnel, our attitude in the tunnel. Because I don't know about you, but just because I know what to do doesn't mean I know how to do it. You know, if you've ever been around kids, at some point in your life, you've asked a child to do something, and they go, I don't want to do it, and then you say, no, you're going to do it. And then what do? They stomp their feet, right? I remember as a kid, I was not the best kid at all times. I was a good kid, but I wasn't the best. I mean, if my parents asked me to get something from upstairs, I made sure they knew every step was walked on all the way up the stairs. And is that the best way to do it? No, because how I do things is as important as what I am doing. In fact, how I do things sometimes is even more important than what I do. But it's not just kids who do this. We as adults do this. Have you ever been handed a task at your job and you said, this is worthless and a waste of my time, and so you put in 20% of your effort? Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're like, so yeah, I love the murmurs and groans. Yeah, that was me. And then you find out later, I mean, I've had that moment before where it's like I was asked to do something and I was like, why am I doing this? And then I put in 50% effort, and then I present it, and it's like, well, this is going to be used for the future of everything we're doing. And I was like, I got to revise some things. Let me get back to you. Let me do this the way I was supposed to do it in the first place. Because the reality is, how we go about doing things is extremely important. This morning, though, we're not talking about our preference in things. Okay, so when I talk like this, a lot of times men and women and spouses, they tend to like nudge elbows. When I'm talking about how we do things, I'm not talking about your preference in how things should be done. I mean, if the grass is getting cut and you're doing it cheerfully, do the lines need to be straight? Not necessarily, okay? I can't cut a straight line with my lawnmower. You're going to have to deal with it if you look at my yard, all right? But the grass gets cut. I do it happily, okay? Here's another thing. If the dishes aren't loaded in the dishwasher correctly, but the dishes are clean when it is done, it doesn't matter how it's loaded as long as the job gets done and the person is doing it cheerfully, right? I'm just being real. All right, and the reality is we can do this both ways, right? We can do this men towards women, women towards men. And the reality is we have preferences on how things should be done, but the reality is if the job gets done, the job gets done. And how the person doing the job does it is what's important. So here's the deal. If you're loading the dishwasher and you're doing it the wrong way, and the wrong way is you being angrily just throwing dishes in the dishwasher, you're like, man, I can't believe I have to do this, blah, blah, blah. That's the wrong way. It's not how they're loaded specifically, it's your attitude when you're doing it, right? I mean, that is what we're talking about. It's our attitude and our demeanor. So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to go back to a story that we talked about in the first message, which is found in John chapter 5, the paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. So I'm going to read from the New King James Version, and you're going to see on the screen the NIV. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the move of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time, there's no verse for this in your version, at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after stirring up the water was made well. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed, and walked. Now, I can't guarantee the exact intentions of what this man responded with when Jesus asked the question, but I said this man gets a bad rap a lot of times. And the reality is, what he says can be interpreted in multiple ways. And so this is what I want to look at. I want to look at verse 7 specifically. He says, "I have no one to put me down into the pool. Instead, when I am on my way, doing what I am supposed to do, someone steps down before me." Now, some of you today here, when you hear that phrase, you go, he's explaining his situation. He's explaining that every time something is possible for him to get healed, somebody goes down ahead of him, and so he doesn't find healing. He's just explaining. Now, some of you read that and you go, I don't understand. Why can't you figure this out? Why are you just complaining about your situation? Why don't you just lay next to the pool until the water gets stirred up? Some of you are going, why is he complaining? It's just a matter of his life at this point. The reality is, the interpretation of explaining and complaining are in our perspective, and the source of the complaining or explaining is found in the heart of the person speaking. Okay, so it's all too easy to interpret explaining as complaining, or depending on our perspective, interpret complaining as explaining. Do I need to say that one more time? Because it's very important that you get this. It's all too easy to interpret explaining as complaining, or depending on our perspective, interpret complaining as explaining. Now, Some of you go, okay, Pastor, why is that important? The reason it's important is this. When somebody is speaking something to you in their life, they're walking through a hard situation, which we've all listened to somebody talk like this, right? We've all heard somebody say, I'm walking through this and it's difficult. But the reality is, it's very easy to interpret one thing as an explanation, and it's also extremely easy to interpret those same words and that same heart as a complaint. And the reality is, the only way to determine what it is, the person listening cannot be the one to figure it out. The only one who can figure it out is God and the person speaking it. And now, what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, it's extremely important. You see, the reason is we have become all too accustomed and so trained to say the right thing that sometimes we say the right thing, but we don't believe it in our heart or in our mind. So the reality is, I'll be walking through a situation and it's extremely difficult, and you know what, I have my doubts and I don't think I'm going to get through it. I will speak the right words to somebody else so that they interpret what I am saying as an explanation, when in reality I am complaining about my situation as best as I can see fit. So we're laughing because the reality is we do this all the time, right? We all don't want to come across as complainers, but the reality is, in our heart and in our mind, we're complaining, we're just saying the right thing. And what I'm trying to get to a point here is that this is this is for real right here. Some of you have been told, fake it till you make it, and I'm here to tell you it's wrong. Don't fake it till you make it, because faking it till you're making it is literally this. It's not happening in my head. It's not happening in my heart. I'm just going to speak it and believe that over time my head and my heart are going to change. The reality is, you can say the right thing all you want. It's not going to change your head or your heart. The only one who's going to do that is Jesus. So you can explain, complain. Yes, that's a hyphenated word right there. You can explain, complain to people as much as you want, but it's not going to change your demeanor, your attitude, or your perspective on your current circumstances. Never fake it till you make it. You know, I like to think about the man we talked about last week in Mark chapter 9, whose son was demon-possessed. And he said, you know, Jesus, if you can do anything to heal my son, like, please, do it. And Jesus says, what do you mean, if you can? Anything is possible for him who believes. And the man responds, I do believe, but would you please help my unbelief? He vocalizes his doubts. He doesn't just say the right thing. He doesn't just say, I do believe. Because that's the right thing to say, right? That would be the right thing to say in that moment. Jesus says, anyone who believes, anything is possible. Well, the right thing to say is, I do believe. But the man says, in his honesty, in his transparency, in his authenticity, Jesus, I do believe, but would you help my unbelief? Because the reality is, that's what's taking place when we vocalize something that hasn't taken root in our head and our heart yet. It's that we do believe it. We do believe it. We know it in some place in our head. But the reality is, it hasn't taken full root. So we need to ask Jesus to help us overcome those doubts in our lives. But there's something so amazing about the man at the pool that we just miss entirely. The man never answered Jesus' question. Now, how many of you have never noticed this before? The man never answered Jesus' question. What did Jesus say? He said, do you want to get well? What does the man say in response? Well, every time I want to go down to the water, this is what happens. He didn't answer the question. But the reality is, in a fake it till you make it mentality, when you always want to say the right thing, what ends up happening is you're not answering the questions that are being given to you. You're just explaining your situation. And the reality is, the more often we get attuned to explaining while we're walking through a tunnel, the harder it is to get out of a tunnel. Why? Because the more you explain, complain, explain, whatever words you want to use, the more you try to do that, the more you become accustomed to it. The more you become accustomed to it. And I'll tell you right now, this is me. This is me in my life. I go, I'm so good at explaining things. I'm so good at explaining things. I'll be walking through a dark tunnel. I'll be like, this is what it is, but, one day Jesus is going to get me out. And the reality is I'm explaining and saying something with my mouth, and then in my mind I'm just like, but is he? Is he going to heal me this side of heaven? I know he will one day, no matter what. One day, no matter what, I'll be good. But is he? Is he going to take care of my finances? Is he going to protect my children? And as I walk through all of these different situations, this is not something I'm preaching to you. I'm with you on this. Why? Because one of the things I know is that the longer we try to explain something, the more it begins to weigh us down. What do I mean by that? When you're walking through a situation and you are just constantly trying to say the right thing, even though in your heart and in your mind you still have doubts, you're literally being someone you're not. Right? You're faking it till you make it. You're saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going through a really rough season right now, but I'm going to be okay. When in your heart you're like, I don't know if I'm going to be okay. The reality is, in those moments where we have unbelief, where we have doubts, you bring that to Jesus until Jesus hands it back to you and he's flipped it upside down. You say, God, I have these doubts. And he says, okay, well, let me explain those doubts to you and why they're not from me. And let me show you how you can trust in me. You know what's amazing is when I begin to walk through these battles and I go, God, I have these doubts. And he goes, oh, you have doubts? Okay. Well, let me take you back to your senior year in high school when I healed you. Let me go back to your sophomore year in college when I healed you. You have doubts. You trust in who I am. And I go, oh man, those doubts, they're fading. Yep. Why? Because when I bring my unbelief to Jesus, Jesus says, I can handle your unbelief. I can handle your doubts. Don't just internalize them and say, I'm going to fake it till I make it. Bring them to Jesus. So what do we take from the paralyzed man at the pool and how we should walk through tunnels? We should not try to explain or complain about our tunnels while we are in them. Because if we do, we may miss the purpose of the tunnel entirely. Why do I say that? Because the more you just try to speak something into existence, that doesn't mean that's the thing that Jesus is trying to do. How many of you have ever prayed for something and God gave you something different? Right? You prayed for one thing and then God's like, okay, I get that you want that, but I have something better for you, so I'm going to give you that instead. And you go, oh, that's amazing. Right? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I love God. I love that he's smarter than me. I love that he loves me more than I love myself. Right? That he says, you may want this, but I have this in store for you. And so the reality is, when we're walking through tunnels, the more we try to explain why we're going through a tunnel, the easier it is to believe for a specific outcome. But that specific outcome may not be what Jesus has intended for that tunnel. So instead, when you're walking through it, this is what you say. You say, yeah, you know what, right now, I'm going through this. I'm walking through cancer. I'm walking through this illness. I'm walking through this relationship problem. I'm walking through this financial problem. And you know what? As I'm walking through it, God has shown himself as real to me. the other side yet, but I'm trusting God is going to bring me through this situation, and I'm going to come out on the other side a better person for it. Amen. You don't have to explain what you think is going to happen. Just trust God. Believe that His plan for you is good. And the other thing we take from it is this. When Jesus extends a hand or He asks you a question, you have to answer and respond. Don't be so used to your tunnel that you refuse to get up or respond. You know what's amazing? Is that Jesus gives the man at the pool a second chance. Yes, He does. Right? Why? Because He asks him, do you want to get well? And he never answers the question. Some of you go, yeah, He did. He said He was going to do. No, that's not what Jesus asked. He was just explaining His tunnel. Yep. But then Jesus gives him a second chance. He says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And we go, well, that's the miracle right there. But there's a second part to that miracle, isn't there? That's right. The man has to get up. Yep. The man has to pick up his mat. The man has to walk. The man has to choose to accept what Jesus has offered to him. But sometimes we get so caught up in the tunnel when Jesus has extended His hand, when Jesus has extended freedom, when Jesus has extended victory, we go, you know what, I'm okay in the tunnel. Why? Because we get more attention in the tunnel. Why? Because you know what, I'm so used to this tunnel that I don't want to get out of it. Why? I'm real comfortable in the tunnel. I'm used to it. Why? Why would we do that to ourselves when the King of the universe has offered a hand, has offered an answer? You accept it, and you choose to walk in victory. Hallelujah. Church, this is something we have to get. So, all right, I'm gonna preach way too long if I don't keep moving. So, all right, I'm getting real excited here. We can't confirm necessarily where the man's heart and mind was at the pool of Bethesda. We don't know. We don't know his heart, but the reality is in that story, these are things that we take from it. You know, I think of, I'll leave that for next week. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to an Old Testament story. I've mentioned it before. I've talked about it in a growth group before. I've never actually preached it. But in Genesis chapter 37, we come across the story, the beginning of the story of Joseph. And if you want to talk about a tunnel that had many twists and turns, a tunnel that was just darkness, I mean literal darkness, for an extended period of time, Joseph is a story that we need to look at. So when we get to the story of Joseph, we understand Joseph is one of the many brothers of the son of Jacob, also known as Israel. And Joseph was his father's favorite. In verse 3 of 37, we see this. This is not going to be on your screen because I'm going to be painting a whole picture for you. So you can listen, you can jot down references if you want, but I encourage you, go back and read the story because it's incredible. 37, beginning of verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, let's just be real here. Is it Joseph's fault that he is his father's favorite? No. All right, so I just have to point that out right away. Anyway. Joseph, so first thing is he's his father's favorite and his brothers don't like him. Now we continue on in verse 5. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. So we begin with this dream given to him by God that is not received well by his brothers. And I don't know about you, I have two younger sisters. I didn't grow up with brothers, okay? I don't get it. I'm raising brothers right now, and it's kind of terrifying in moments. I'm just being honest with you because they love to wrestle. I didn't have that growing up. We had concrete exposed in our family room for a little while there, and I was like, please, please, please do not slam somebody's head into the ground. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, that's just the reality of it. You can stop it as much as you want, but they're just play wrestling. They're not actually fighting, but anyway. So first he's his father's favorite. Then he has this dream where his brothers are bowing down to him essentially. And if you're a brother, you're going to look at that and go, nope. I don't know who you think you are, Joseph. But I'm older, I'm wiser, I'm stronger. Ain't no way I'm bowing down to you. You've lost your mind. So then, it goes further. Joseph has another dream, and he shares this dream with his brothers and his dad, where in this case, the sun and the moon and these stars are bowing down to him. And his dad's like, Joseph, you're my favorite and all, but you're going to have to stop right there. Because you should keep that to yourself. Not wise to speak that. But in this moment, you got to think. If you're waking up with these dreams, if you're your father's favorite, and the reality is, Israel had given Joseph a very ornate robe. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? That's what that is. It's his nice thing that separates him, that makes him look good. Joseph's got to be feeling really good about himself in this moment. But the reality is, he could have seen the darkness of the tunnel coming when he heard the hate from his brothers. Anybody ever been in that kind of situation? Where you're like, things are going well, but you begin to see a turn in the tide, and you go, oh man, I'm about to walk through it. This isn't going to be good. Maybe it's a diagnosis. Yeah. Maybe it's I'm leaving. The reality is, we can see darkness coming before we enter it. And as we continue on in Genesis chapter 37, we get to verse 18. So, Joseph is sent by his father. So he's trying to find his brothers who are watching some flocks of sheep. And so, verse 18, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty and there was no water in it. So he's been stripped of his ornate robe, and he's been tossed into the cistern, which, in case you don't know what a cistern is, he's been thrown into a pit. A pit that he's not getting out of on his own. And so this is where Joseph has gone from. He's gone from this dream, he's gone from daddy's favorite, to now he's looked at by his brothers. He's like, I'm going to kill him. So it's like, thankfully Reuben spoke up and he did not die. So he's just thrown into a pit. Well, now they're just trying to determine what's going to go on. Reuben was hoping to get him back to his father. But in verse 26, Judah said to his brothers, What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Can we laugh about that, by the way? Yes. He's our brother, his own flesh and blood. So we shouldn't kill him, but we'll just sell him into slavery. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. So now he's gone from dream to pit to being sold into slavery. And if you look further into verse 36, he's been sold once. Then in verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So now he's exchanged hands from slavery and slavery. Well, at Potiphar's house, though, he doesn't complain. And in fact, what you find in verse 2 is something amazing about this tunnel that Joseph is in. The Lord was with Joseph. Yea, though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Now here's the reality. The man is still a slave. And as we get further into when we read that passage right there, when we read those verses, we go, man, Joseph had it good. You lost your mind. The man is not his own. his master. He can't make decisions for himself. But in his slavery position, in the tunnel that God has him in, what he says is that I'm going to submit that this is God's plan for me, and I'm going to live with excellence in it anyway. So Joseph says, if Potiphar has me in this position, I'm going to do what I can. If Potiphar has me in this position, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. Not 10%, not 20%, I'm going to give it my all. But Potiphar's wife caught the eye. Joseph caught the eye of Potiphar's wife. I'm not going to read this whole passage, but essentially what happens is Potiphar's wife, like Joseph, come lay in bed with me. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I submit to my master. Look at what I've been blessed with. Which he's in slavery and he's saying, look at what I've been blessed with. I'm not going to turn my back on my master in this moment. Well, eventually one day Joseph walks into the house and Potiphar's wife is the only one there. She grabs him by his cloak. And this is like temptation 101, right? Nobody's around. You know what? Nothing's really gone your way in a really long time. It's your opportunity to take advantage of something. What does Joseph do? He runs out of there without his cloak on. He removes himself from the temptation. He says, no, I'm not going to give in to this. I'm going to honor God with my purity in this moment. So what does Joseph do? He runs out. Well, Potiphar's wife doesn't take too kindly to that, because obviously she's been rejected in that moment. And so she lies to the staff. She lies to her husband. And he's like, you brought this slave in here, and he came on to me. So now Joseph has been what? He's been dream, pit, slavery. Now he's been lied about, right? Some of you, right there, like being lied about is a terrible thing to walk through in your life. So now, though, Potiphar, he's upset. What does he do? He throws him into prison. Now, what's amazing about this is, in all of this situation, we find here, I don't know what chapter we're in at this point. It might be 38 or 39. 39. Verse 20, it says, but while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. God was still with him in the tunnel. He continued to maintain speed. He kept the light on. He kept the faith, believing that one day he'd get out. One day he'd be out of the tunnel. Even though he'd been through so many twists and turns, the darkness of the tunnel just kept getting darker and darker. And then finally, one day, Pharaoh has thrown his chief cupbearer and his chief baker into prison. And they both have dreams one night. Joseph sees them. He sees that they're upset. They say they had dreams that they can't understand or figure them out. So Joseph interprets the one for the baker, second, but I'm just going to give it to you. He tells the baker, hey, Pharaoh's going to rise you up and you're going to die. He's going to kill you. And sure enough, that's what happened. But to the cupbearer, this is what Joseph says in verse 12, in chapter 40. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. Well, when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Now see, we always read the passages of this is what Joseph was put in. He was put in favor with the warden. He was put in favor with Potiphar. The Lord made him successful. And we go, mentally, man, it wasn't that bad. But this is a man who's desperate. If you listen to those words, obviously Joseph is not happy with the situation he's in. What does he say? He says, get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. He sees his opportunity. Sometimes we read the story of Joseph and we think it's good, but reality is he's in a tunnel. He's in a tunnel. And in the tunnel, God was with him. And in the tunnel, God showed him kindness and favor. Sometimes when we're in a tunnel, right? This is our reality. I talked about this in week 1. Sometimes we're in a tunnel and we can't see any kindness because we're so focused on the tunnel. We're not staying on the path that God has us on. So when he showers his kindness and his mercy and his grace on us, we're not willing to accept it or see it for what it is because all we're thinking about is the tunnel. If you would just open your eyes to see what God has for you, you can be like Joseph too, and he can bring you prosperity in the tunnel. And when I say prosperity, I'm not talking about just getting out. I'm just saying while you're in it, he's going to show you favor. But as we continue on, it just gets worse. Verse 23, we're hit with another extremely sad, other dark turn in the tunnel. Joseph had seen a glimpse of light. He saw an opportunity. But in verse 23, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. So we got pit, slavery, lied about, prison, forgotten. And in all of these things, he doesn't curse God that we see in Scripture. He does everything that he's asked to do with excellence. He has hope. He's maintained speed. He's staying in his lane, believing that one day God's going to get him out of the tunnel. Eventually, one day, Pharaoh has a dream that nobody else can interpret. And the cupbearer finally, in a moment, remembers. Why do you think the cupbearer finally remembered? Well, because it was time for Joseph to come out of the tunnel. And so the cupbearer remembers, hey, Pharaoh, I met this guy in prison, and you need to bring him here. And so Joseph gets brought before Pharaoh. Joseph, it says the dream, interprets the dream. And Pharaoh is like, hey, part of the dream scenario was you're going to have 7 years of harvest, and you're going to have 7 years of famine. And so Joseph is put in charge. Pharaoh says, you are a wise man, obviously, and obviously God's with you. And so you know what? I'm going to put you in charge of our harvest, of our everything. So Joseph is put number 2 in command under Pharaoh. So in the 7 years of harvest, Joseph is storing up and storing up and storing up and storing up and storing up. So that when 7 years of famine comes along, what's amazing is this. It's a cool thing. It's also a terrible thing. Is that in the famine, Egypt gains more power because they have all this food. And so they're able to sell it off so that Pharaoh has more power because of what Joseph did. Egypt has more power. But also God's plan is at work in this entire scenario. You see, he had gone from pit to slavery, lied about prison, forgotten. But eventually Joseph reaches his palace. Joseph, in a moment here, is out of the tunnel. But the reality is that there's another tunnel being walked through. The future Hebrew people are about to go without food. Yeah. And so his brothers show up on the scene. Don't worry, I'm going to wrap this up here real quick because some of you are like, where's Pastor at? We're like 11:55. It's okay. You might get out at 12:05 today, but you're going to be okay. So here's where we're at. So the brothers show up before Joseph asking for food, and Joseph plays back and forth with them because they can't see that it's Joseph. And Joseph's actual brother, same mom, isn't there. And he says, isn't there another brother? I want that brother. You bring him here. And so they go back and forth and back and forth. And then finally we get to this point in chapter 45 where Joseph has sent all of his staff out. And in verse 45, verse 1, this is what it says. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. He cries out, everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. You see, his brothers, they're in a tunnel, unwilling to answer a question because they're stuck. Yeah. They're stuck in the tunnel of guilt. Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here. Understand what Joseph's saying in this moment. It was not you who brought these circumstances upon my life, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Can I get the instruments to come forward this morning? You see, Joseph understood the entire time, but he finally gets to declare it in the end. God brought him into the tunnel, God brought him through the tunnel, and God brought him out of the tunnel. But in the midst of the tunnel, he served the best he could. He kept hope in his dream. He didn't give up on God. He didn't give in to temptation because he knew one day he'd be on the other side of his tunnel and everything that he had gone through would have been worth it. And in this moment where he's out, he says, God put me here to save lives. What you intended for harm, God intended for good. You had no idea what God was doing in that moment, but my circumstances of my life are not controlled by any other person in this world but God. Amen. Can you say that this morning? Can you say that no one but God controls the circumstances of your life? Because if you believe that He holds your life in His hands, that it doesn't matter what comes your way, because you can trust that He has you in the tunnel for a purpose. You know, one of the things that I read sometimes is that joy is found in the journey. Anybody ever heard that? Right? Joy is not found in the destination. Joy is found in the journey. And with Joseph, the truth of the matter is that the joy of the Lord, the joy that God provided, was his strength in his tunnel. But joy is not found in the journey. Joy is received, chosen, and accepted for the journey. What do I mean by that? Joy is not something we find in anything but God Himself. And therefore, joy is a gift, which I talked about at Christmas time. Joy is a gift from God to His children, to His people, to be accepted so that we can be strengthened through the tunnels we walk through. I'm going to tell you right now, the only way to walk through a tunnel the way that you should is with the joy of the Lord on your side. The only way to walk through the tunnel that you're walking through is with the peace of God overwhelming your heart and your soul. But the only way to do that is if you stay tied to Jesus. You see, your tunnel will always be dark. Your tunnel will never look good. But the reality is, even in the darkest valley, you should fear no evil, for your God is with you. His rod and His staff, they comfort you. And surely His goodness and His love will follow you all the days of your life. And you will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's pray this morning. God, I'm so thankful that you have brought us to this place. God, I'm so thankful that you have shown us, God, that even when we walk through dark valleys, even when we walk through dark tunnels, you are with us. God, and when we walk through these tunnels, we don't have to walk through them complaining. We don't have to walk through them explaining. What we get to do as your children and say, this is my circumstance, but my God is with me. My God has brought me here. My God is bringing me through this, and one day I will say my God has brought me out of it. But for now, I trust in my God. He's strengthening me with His joy. He's giving me His peace. God, be with us this morning as we reflect on your love, on your joy, on your peace. And may we change our perspective and our attitude, that we walk through the tunnels of this life, not as complainers, not as explainers, but as children of the living God who trust in their Heavenly Father, in His love, who are strengthened by His joy and endure because of His peace. In the name of Jesus I pray. Amen.